So Gareth, thank you so much for, at the drop of a hat, being willing to chat to us for a few minutes about intergenerational ministry.
No worries, very happy to be here.
And so first of all, let's start off with something really, really simple. What excites you about intergenerational ministry?
So very briefly, I've been at Cliff College now as a lecturer for just over a year. Before that, I was for 12 years youth, children, families minister in a church. And so my interest in intergenerational church and family ministry as well came out of my very real struggles to do mission and ministry on the ground as a youth, children, families minister over 12 years. So my excitement for it came out of, rather than kind of just like an intellectual kind of curiosity, it came out of a practical need when I was looking at youth and children on the ground and thinking, you know, how are these people, these young people, best served in terms of helping them show who Jesus is, helping them to follow Jesus? How's that best done? And through my reading and reflection, interacting with my practice, the whole kind of like world of family ministry and also intergenerational church both came to the fore. So historically, before that, I was very much a youth worker. I'd been a youth leader for many years with Crusaders way back in the day. But now this was me thinking, why isn't really what I think I should be doing really working? And when I started to sort of tap into family ministry, but intergenerational church, I know it's our subject today more specifically, I started to see fruit, which was really exciting. And one of the things, so just to give you a flavour, it's when you see, like I did, a guy being confirmed when he's about 15, and they say, tell us a little bit about your journey of faith. And he tells them a little bit about journey of faith. And then he says, and you know, there's someone who's really influential in my faith journey. And there I am as the youth leader thinking, oh, he's going to say me, isn't he? And he says, you know, Bob, or whatever the guy's name was, who does this work on the sound desk. And Bob was a guy in his 60s. That wasn't his real name. And he just used to take an interest in this guy and used to help him see how the sound desk worked. And over time spoke words of grace and truth about Jesus to him over the years. And to me, that was really exciting. And then when reflecting theologically on intergenerational ministry, I think very briefly, and there's a chapter in a book I can point you to, which points to this in more detail. But I think for me, the really exciting thing about intergenerational ministry is it is the trajectory of biblical theology. So what I mean by that is, I think we start with a physical family in Genesis, and I think we end with a spiritual family in Revelation. And I think that the journey that everyone needs to undertake, and I think developmentally that's really important for seeing how children change into youth, who change into adults, that there is that exciting idea that actually this is the direction of travel. You know, whether we're doing youth work or family ministry, we need to be thinking in terms of the church is the end goal, the gathering around the throne of everyone of all ages and nations. And that's the exciting thing. And seeing that beginning to happen in practice is absolutely brilliant. So yeah, that's just a little picture of practically and academically, or theologically, if you like, why it excites me.
Thank you so much. And then I wonder what are the challenges that you've experienced both as a practitioner and the kind of those that you discover as you delve deeper as an academic?
Yeah. So loads. Anyone trying to do this, and so pretty much everyone who's listening, I'm sure, will have their own set of challenges. So my PhD is particularly looking at impediments and opportunities and encouragements to IG and family ministry. And I'll talk about the ones that came up in the case studies that I did. But just before I do that, just to make sure we're all on the same page, what I mean anyway by IG, and we can all mean different things by different words, is I guess what Holly Katzenallen, if you want a good kind of starting textbook, if you like, on IG, her book with Christine Ross was Intergenerational Christian Formation, IVP, 2012. But still very, very helpful in understanding IG. And they basically say it's when the whole of the church, so it's very much about the church rather than the family or the peer group. It's very much about the church. When the church kind of gets around to bi-directionally and in a mutual participative way, learn from all ages at the same time. And that's really important because people might just think you're doing intergenerational work when you're doing like a classic all-age service where there's one person at the front and they're talking to all ages in front of them. Now that's great, but that's multi-generational, because several generations are present in the room listening or engaging with the same thing up front. But the interaction is what makes a multi-generational setting intergenerational, and that's quite important, because it's got a lot to say about the challenges. The challenges for multi-generational are different from challenges to intergenerational. So we've got to have an idea that it's when people turn towards each other and there's bi-directional teaching and mutuality and participation between the generations. Now, the reason I sort of focus in on that is that actually what you start to see when you start to think a little bit about intergenerational church and why it may or may not be working, so the challenges, as you were saying, and if you flip that round, then what are the key elements of if you're trying to foster intergenerational culture, is someone's underlying theology. So I think it's quite clear, and I come from a fairly conservative background, so I talk about this not necessarily through my research, but also through my background in churches. I think intergenerational ministry is less, if you like, sits less well the more conservative you are. Now, that isn't me saying if you're conservative theologically, you should change so that you can embrace IG, because of course it shouldn't work like that. But it does mean that you've got to kind of think about your practice and what you're doing and how it sits with the rest of your theology, because of course we've all seen this happen where somebody pragmatically goes, oh, where's that silver bullet that's going to stop children leaving the church? Oh, it's called youth ministry. Oh no, now it's called family ministry. Oh no, now it's called IG. Let's use that, and hooray, we've solved the problem. And of course, what we want to do is think much more deeply about that and say, actually, is this commensurate? Does it fit with my commitments, my theological commitments? And so I think some of the things in IG that are problematic for more conservative people are things like that idea of mutuality and bidirectional teaching, because I think there's a massive overlap between IG people and people who adopt a very kind of Rebecca-and-I approach to children's spirituality. Because of course, if you're saying, let's learn from each other, what you're saying is what the children bring is really important. Now, everyone's going to say that that's true, but what you'll find in more conservative settings is a hierarchical sort of setting where it's like the children need to be taught because the children don't know things, a much more cognitive approach. Whereas the kind of Rebecca-and-I children's spirituality approach is, look, cognition is overrated. Don't teach children because actually they're closer to God when they're born because they're innocent and all the rest of it. We won't go into that now, no time. But actually at that point, you can see immediately how that's going to be much more fertile ground for IG immediately, because you're saying actually the child, I should be learning from them, not the other way around. So your idea of preaching and teaching, and your idea, and that obviously plays into other things like your view of sin and original sin and all those sorts of things, they're all going to be massively important. So now this doesn't, if this seems slightly theoretical to you, just think about it for a minute. If you go into a church and you try and kind of foster an IG kind of like culture where it's like, yeah, let's learn from each other, and then you're getting a lot of resistance. You think, I don't understand why this resistance is there. It might be that that's because some people got a very different understanding of the child and of teaching and preaching to you, and the office of the elder, for example, or the minister or the priest or whatever. And so you've got to understand that, otherwise you'll bang your head against a brick wall at the, if you like, the presenting issue, when actually there's something way behind that that's dictating the presenting issue. And you find all sorts of things alongside that. We haven't got time to go into that, but if you want to read more into it, you can start thinking of things like, what about someone's view of the Trinity? Believe it or not, that can be a challenge to IG. And the reason I say that is because if you have what we'll call a difference between a social Trinitarianism and a hierarchical Trinitarianism, where hierarchical Trinitarianism is the traditional posture that Protestants have taken over the years, and so the Father sends the Son, who sends the Spirit, and so they're all equal in value, but they are there is if you like, an ordering in terms of sending. Social Trinitarianism would be that idea of the dance. The perichoresis is the word that gets thrown around, and that's much more about the equality of the social relationship that's going on within the Trinity. And you can see that one then actually is much more fertile ground for IG than the other. So if you've got a social Trinitarian understanding, you're much more likely to be the sort of person that, as he embraces that kind of participative idea of a dance that's going on between people. Whereas if you're more of a hierarchicalist, and again, don't let your practice drive your theology in that way, but it is important to think, what's stopping IG at this point? And if I may, just one more minute on that. If you are in a more conservative church that is more hierarchical, then I've got a chapter in another book, and I can mention these books at the end, John, so that people have got them, which argues then for a doctrine of accommodation as a way of actually saying to people who are in hierarchical positions, well, actually, fine, if you want to go with that, that's great, but then actually drawing on Paul's work in Paul's letter in Corinthians, especially 1 Corinthians 9 to 11, you need to accommodate those that have less knowledge than you and less power, and those are inevitably going to be children. And so I think what I would be saying if I was going into any church in terms of the challenges, the first thing I'd want to know is, tell me about your underlying theology that drives your church, because the way I'm going to help you with your IG is going to vary depending upon your underlying theology. I've probably talked for way too long. So
all of that's gold. Thank you so much. I have another question for you that's just popped into my head that might that might draw upon some more of your experiences, maybe a practitioner as well. But an awful lot of our churches have either no young people or few young people, being that children or young people turn up with grandparents occasionally on a Sunday, or they're infrequent attenders. So how can that church that rarely has one or more generations turning up on a regular basis be a more intentionally intergenerational church community?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, starting from scratch is going to be an issue if you don't have, sort of all the generations present. And what I would say before, as a big preface as well, is that again, there's no point simply starting at the IG level if there's something else going on, and of course that could be anything in a particular church context. And so I think it would be worth wrapping all that up. If you're in a church and you're thinking, I'd love to do more of this because we don't have those generations present we want to, as I've kind of tilted at before, you've got to ask those other questions, like, what are there other reasons why, is the only reason that we're in this situation because we haven't adopted IG before? It's probably no. So for example, if you're not clearly proclaiming the gospel, both in word and in deed, in your community, then you might think, well, actually, maybe that's the reason, that nobody's here. If you read the book of Acts and see what was going on in the book of Acts, if you're not doing that sort of thing, that kind of idea of going out and in a contextually relevant way, heralding the gospel as Paul and Peter do in the book of Acts, and creating communities that are radically different from the world around them. If you're not doing that, then in some ways, don't worry about the IG piece. That's secondary. But if you are doing those things, then I think these other questions of IG and family ministry all come to the fore, become really important. I think there are some big questions around if you're going to want to, let's assume all those things are in place, you're proclaiming the gospel in word and deed, you don't have many children, you want to create something that is IG, you've got to first then also think, are the church on board with this? It's not the leader or whoever can't just have a great idea. It's got to be something that everyone's going to commit to. It's got to be something that's realistic and doable. And it might mean creating something new. I mean, the accommodation thing I talked about before is actually something I think is very much calling people to change what they're actually doing. Don't create something new over there, because that means you're not accommodating. You're just creating something new for them over there. But if that's not possible, then do create something new that is both kind of gospel oriented, biblically oriented, but then also intergenerationally driven. I mean, Messy Church I think is a great. I don't. What people do often is they just grab the label. Oh, we're doing Messy Church, and that's going to solve life. We do Alpha, that's going to solve life. No, I'm sure. There's a lot of things that pass under the label Messy Church that really aren't Messy Church, sure, as Lucy would see it. Lucy Moore would see it. But launch something new, but make sure everyone's behind it. And there is a real mission opportunity there, because some research is now showing that people who are not from a church background are actually quite hesitant, firstly, with that whole idea of my children going out to a group. They're much happier with with everyone staying together.
Mm.
And part of that is they're not quite sure what their children are going to do. Maybe their children are nervous. But also I think, and I can't prove this to be true, I think actually if adults got children with them, it's a little bit of a shield for them as well. So they feel less exposed. If it's just like the minister talking at them, they feel a little bit exposed. If actually they're doing some sort of interactive, participative things with their children, I think that's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to enter into those things. And you can make those things very interactive. You can move from a kind of who let the dads out kind of environment into a more messy church environment, and it's a less of a jump for people. That's much easier. And you can launch something new like that, which is attractive to people that you might have contact with in your local context. I've talked way too much again.
Look, Gareth, that was amazing. That was pure gold. Thank you so much for your time. And yeah, I will leave you in peace.